The projections assert that the original market and preparation of David finding the hydrogen vehicle's maker would have actively given him an account on the brokerage which would have manufactured the exponential increase of hydrogen, which David would have co-signed from his travels of being able to observe the differences of air quality. So when he would go around factories which actively pollute toxins in the air, which smells, his original childhood version of it is that they're the fart factories, and these fart factories would have actively been shut down by the political movement from David's influence, forcing them to upgrade their technology, functionally moving this into the high pollution areas such as New York or in California. He would have actively co-signed the hydrogen exponentially increasing in order to reduce the pollution because the fart factories would have exponentially been increased into the condensed function of carbon vehicles, which generates the acknowledgement that would have systematically been observed as the political influence for his hyperacceleration from their projections, which tells us that the increase would have exponentially used David's use of nuclear technology from those advancements in order to have created the hydrogen, at which point his hyper investment into those developments would have started from the functions of the nuclear, which is already being used in order to leverage the full function of the nuclear power in order to produce as much hydrogen as possible, which allows him to begin to lay the groundwork of the national road trip for hydrogen vehicles path for fuel centers, including his function of air security for New York, which would have stopped 9/11 from the projections in the military. This also includes the function of those fuel sensors actively being adapted to fit into car garages. So, you would make a large tower um, where parking garages would be able to stack exponentially in collaboration with the hydrogen fuel, which would facilitate the base building for many of the air security functions of the helicopters or others that would have been adapted for the additional air security under those agreements, disconnected from the city of New York and disconnected from the United States military, influenced by other members of David's peer generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff who wanted the air security to have been shut off, which David uniquely had the authority to ignore. David's studies of these functions, including his hyper education for specific expertise as a specialty before the generalization broadens out, is based upon the contract obligations of those that, having been prepared to make deals with David, would have required his educated answer as quickly as possible, forcing him into a position to receive the hyper education of becoming the expert in that specific field before he could co-sign, facilitating the insurance which has covered it, which is trying to get him to co-sign his leverage, um, requires him to have finished those due diligences before they could have done so. At which point, David, not being vulnerable to it, is fully covered by the people who are presenting it to him. They just need his leverage to conduct the liens off of his future trades. At which point, David, being born into the contract schedule, projecting his future exponential contracts, in collaborations with his other works, facilitates his ability to trade the potential from those contracts into those contracts, at which point the manifestation is basically on birth for all of the luxuries and accelerations of those advantages, requiring his specific attention, which allows for the broader aspects to come in whenever they need to, but specifically the advancement of that education from the School of Hard Knocks is a unique advantage from those obligations. At which point the advancement of those functions would have allowed him to systematically replace all of those engagements so that he would not have to tolerate living in any of those locations until the remedy has fully set in. And with David's political influence, he could get government contracts to specifically validate those functions. Uh, at which point the population being complicit with those policies from David would have systematically reduced the pollution in any area that he deemed necessary to focus on for hyper disillusionment for his comfort or his interests. At which point, David's contracts, like maintenance, including cleaning, navy, rust, and other functions, would include the schedule to move David's secret arms to be sold to common troops. So the function of the general maintenance, the government needs to comply with various contracts, at which point the systematic position of having ignored it was a direct reaction to David being the primary contractor. So whenever they wanted political influence or political currency, they would have to go to David as the power broker, which required them to comply on many of those status quo contracts. At which point, whenever David engaging in the construction and maintenance of the higher secrecy from intelligence oversight functions, he would have original access to the highest grade secret classified technologies. So when it would start with him and it would dissolve back into the general troop population, at which point, whenever they deal with David on the military fronts, he's exponentially ahead of everyone technologically, uh, beyond even what his peer generals are able to have access to knowing about, which gives him a major head above shoulders beyond them whenever they start engaging in their proxy wars against him. And this would also include the overlapping functions in the intention of those who are actively guiding the caravan on the various exchanges for their specific interests. So the ones who have the most interest in X, Y, or Z are going to actively be encouraging contracts in those directions for the overlapping compounding effects, such as taking the caravan through the Northern Californian rancher area where it smells like piss and shit. These types of things would have actively been reinforced to the position of getting those contracts moving as quickly as possible for their upgrades to be compelled. Subversions of these contracts and others, which are mostly censored from the engagement of the free market, such as the observations of the various manipulations in the general public in the generation of collapsing society, such as Fatima Stanford, who acknowledged that being fat is a genetic trait, at which point the position of it being genetic as opposed to a lifestyle function is on the basis of the wizard communist targeting of parties on the basis of race, which specifically has them tracked by the military industrial educational complex, which generates the mechanism of compelling them into those vulnerabilities, manufacturing the criminal results from their false experiments as they engage in the subversion of the general public by their criminal secret, which she has indicated from source materials that I've seen that this has been going on for at least 50 years. So if they're poisoning targets, such as the use of coercion for forced ingestion by their secret government manipulations, then the compulsion of the overriding of their body through the nerve hacking and other mechanisms allows them to systematically being overpowered as they're corralled as chattel, as slaves without due process, engaging in the mechanism of the compulsion of whatever arbitrary thing is falsely being studied for the amusement of the bullies and the psychopaths. At which point, the research into Ozempic for the anti-obesity function is claimed to be structural racism if the government does not fund it, because the government created the problem, and thus the government has to fund the remedy, being the observation. At which point, it is a clever bit of wizard communists for the white nationalists to have been able to have cornered that market. At which point, the engagement of those who are causing the problems or paid to cause the problems are in a total network system from the military industrial educational complex to use the function of the funding to the educational members in order to, in one cell, conduct the offense, and then the other cells do all of the other aspects, including the false remedy from the generation of the experiments where the targets are being stalked for the active analysis of the various results of all of the manipulations, at which point all of these are studied in secret against the unintended targets of the various mechanisms. So the victims being observed for the side effects of all of these engagements are criminally being targeted and being exploited. It is necessary that the person be secure in the person, their papers, and their effects, but they're not. They are not consenting targets, at which point it is structural racism to have compelled onto them the violation of their right to their person. Their body is their property and they don't have a right to subvert it. And the compelled service of using their body as a lab experiment is structural racism as itself, at which point the engagement of the observation of the original market compels the engagement of the transfer of those resources back to the original owners for the funding of the reconstruction of that market, and thus disconnected from the advantage of the wizard communists who are responsible for the crime in the first place. Pancreatic cancer is a food-borne illness which actively being put into the mechanism of targets in order to engage in the coercion against the general public, including the coercion against David against his friends from the projection from the military intelligence, manifests the inability of their persons to be able to escape the criminal injury, at which point the act of murder, of forcing them into that weakness, is espionage civil war. It's Confederates overthrowing the United States, such as their targeting of Japan for revenge, not only against the World War II vets who have racist tendencies towards the Japanese, but they actively collaborate with David's enemies, who are the majority, including the function of the Satanists, who are seeking the one world government, are actively engaging in those retaliations, specifically as a mechanism of their opposition to David as a structural function, which generates the satanic antichrist rituals, which compels the isolation and the prevention of being able to engage in the exchanges without without his title, at which point the function of all exchanges being forgeries or manipulations prevent the educated, sober answers from the conversation, making David effectively mute from any of those conversations for the express purpose of the depression of the human decency of the various targets who engage in the extortions for the results to manifest in their rituals according to their secret tendencies and rights under the military industrial educational process complex, which is actively infiltrated by these Satanist freaks. and their connections to the projections of David with the Japanese exponentially compound on this problem, as they have been designed for population collapse as a target for genocide, at which point the inability of them to be able to defend themselves in a conventional war doesn't apply to the function of the obstructed evidence actively creating the substantive results, which is the same basic results as though it was an open conflict without the acknowledgement of what is happening to them. Many of the threats against the general public, including the wizard communism, through the KKK contracts with the police, such as Lindsey Graham's lawfare function, facilitates the mechanism of their central planned economy for the white nationalist interests, at which point their entire strategy of conducting the crime generates their blocking of the information through their investment into the illusion, which generates the alternative results, at which point the assumption of the black community being obstructed actively reinforces the construct of that communism to be against them, at which point the irony is that the black community would be socially engineered by the white nationalists into communism, which is the mechanism of their oppression, at which point their active celebration of the thing that's hurting them is self-inflicted injury without the correct due diligence, because the mechanism of the illusion and the defrauding of the government systemically creates an alternative, at which point the opposite of the wizard communism isn't communism, it's capitalism, which is the act of blocking the government from making the subversion on the basis of race and others, which is actively being blocked from the courts of record in order to substantially change the results, including the function of altering the court results of black on black crime, which isn't really a problem when you understand that the wizard communisms are the ones generating the illusion by the exponential compounding interest of the government's investment into the ability to conduct the illusion by secrets, at which point the fart, which indicates that there was foul play, wasn't able to be tracked, at which point their blocking of the correct information means you can't engage in the function of the correct public record generating the remedy, at which point you have the substantive position of centrally planned functions such as the reporters of the white nationalist double agents who actively subverting the Fairness Doctrine redirect the viewers to them away from the obstructed who would have originally received the benefit of their specific service. At which point, the engagement of those specifically uses the uh, compromising of targets, such as the creation of the Jewish anti Semites who actively collaborate with international agreements in order to manufacture those results, generating the precedence of their own injury on maturity, such as, but is not limited to, the function of the blacks subverting David while receiving the injury by the use of the straw man, which generates the confirmation of all whites are born racist, which generates the predetermined answer of subverting the actual free market, which is that the black community, having received the subversion of those mechanisms from the wizard communists, are blocking the solution by selective target high priority targets, which generates their ability to take out their anger on the solution to the problems, which is them permanently restraining themselves into their problem. At which point, the use of the insurance market from the original calculation would have actively generated the function of private schools for the target communities who are owed the insurance mechanism, and those private Ivy League schools being a part of the insurance market would have hyper accelerated their education in general, which is essential to understand the function of the magnitude of their suppression, as the Ivy League education being the thing that they fell from signifies the comparison, at which point their original engagement from the very beginning indicated from the record of the $15 an hour being exclusively into those functions means the black community can't rely on the white nationalist public school funding, which requires them to conduct their own independent functions, which through those insurance mechanisms, which is specifically designed to not trigger the offenses of those parties while still engaging in the proper exchanges of those commerce, would have to have generated these types of mobile private schools for the Ivy League acceleration, which maintains the status quo minimum value, which would have been aggressively compounded, at which point the observation of the highest critical threats, which is arbitrary and changeable on the basis of one action, another answer would be specifically correct as the retaliation, requires the adaptivity of the various attacks that could happen. So, by definition, the insurance market would actively be redirecting those earnings into those directions as they stabilize their society, which tracks the Ivy League schools, such as the School of Hard Knocks from David's network, all of the way down from the highest levels of college to the entry level into school, at which point all ages would receive the best training for each of the positions, at which point the compounding interest of those knowledges specifically tailored to their specific crafts which they would be mastering, allowing them their family trade and then their general entertainments for themselves personally as the backup mechanism would facilitate the compounding interest of their stability, as the things that the white nationalists don't have a problem with, such as the use of them doing hard manual labor or them working in the sewers, or these types of affairs, would not be subverted, at which point those hardy problems would have been solved by that series of apprenticeships specifically designed for those results, which would have been essential for David's network as the zombie insurance requires them to have mastered them and not rely on outside parties of the general culture, but to be internally stable, allowing them to engage in their stable function and expand their services to the other parts of the community. Now, blocking this information from being appropriately divulged to the general public, it was conducted through the Nazis in the FBI and others, intimidating and overthrowing the president, such as their compromising of Ronald Reagan, who attacked the Fairness Doctrine Expo Facto in order to prevent David from manifesting under the specific targeting of David Bowles, as his National News Corporation and other essential functions would have disseminated the information, ruining the entire con of their wizard communist loyalties. Now, the projections of the liability being connected with inside family would specifically be problematic, as punishments on the basis of race or having bad family would require the criminals in question to co-sign the felonies, at which point, if the relatives directly involved are supported by them, then by definition it is a conspiracy to aid and abet for their acceleration of inherited wealth or stability, as their maintained human decency is funded by the use of those crimes. They would actively be co-signing so long as they do not condemn them, at which point the status quo function of receiving the benefits means there's agreement is to do the crime unless they specifically condemn it, which is the top rated criminal intent bracket for liability. As a debt to society or federal debt in school, federal debt arrangements type situations, these types of debts will follow them to the till their grave and throughout time. As long as they are attached to it, they have to pay it, at which point they would be permanently attached to it, ruining their entire posterity or condemnation of the offender. which would require the co-signing under the original American policies of restraining the Confederates under treason from David's original American function of policies, which they're obstructing, and thus acknowledge the viability of its correctness. Treason by the Confederate hate criminals to be sentenced to the Confederate state to pay off the liabilities of their debts to society as a national debt requires those who are rejecting it, who have directly received the proximity of that, to be obligated to accelerate their debts by paying into the network interest, which would be the extortion of those parties to pay off their liabilities, at which point the thing would have to be settled with them choosing to make aggression in one direction or the other, to the offender or to the victim. Fairness and justice is essential to national security. Either way, it seems that they must be compelled to pay, as secrecy is the primary mechanism of their offenses. So, by definition, the compulsion could either have their condemnation, receive the benefit of the credit, or in their acceptance, the liability of the exclusive guilt to their co signing the offense. The compounding interest of the various cons concealed by the wizards systematically requires the full due diligence of compelled uh, the extraction of the information, at which point it becomes necessary to engage in the full due diligence to the most aggressive form necessary, at which point you have many arrangements, such as the obstruction of contracts, which form into the obstructions of treaties, such as the arrangements of military functions under David's treaties, which form states as a direct collaboration uh, in its subordinate territory for the economic exchanges, including the function of the security arrangements, which generate the obligation of generating the various offices and degrees and hierarchies, including the highest grade mechanism of the officers who engaged in heavy tier functions as military functions, as security functions, at its various arrangements, have to systematically create footholds, at which point they would be carrying the majority of the security blocking artillery forms against them, at which point they would be creating artificial mobile detachments and modular functions for those barriers in order to solidify those footholds, such as those actively protecting the artillery, which is essential to the function of covering the forward observers. And you have to understand that the advantage from all of these and more, derived by the fraudulent executions of the obstruction of the core evidence, such as the position of fraudulently claiming an ongoing investigation, which exponentially compounds over decades, is the opposite of the right of a speedy trial, which generates their obligation to prove their case within that reasonable amount of time instead of using the process as a mechanism of the punishment, at which point you have such mechanisms such as the permanent fraudulent injuries generated by the POW generation, which generates their connection to the false experiments, which is used as leverage for the abuse and torture and criminal punishments by Confederacy without violation of American law of the victims as a pre-crime scenario which generates their ability to defend and craft the general public and its government, disconnecting the United States from the civilian authority. And this generates extortions of all against all constitutional right, including the right to not have the government suppress the means of maintaining human decency and status without due process, which is objectively their core ambition under their white nationalist KKK contracts, generating the weakness to national security. The United States is a rule of law society. Thus, the nation is the rule of law. Thus, national security is the security of the rule of law. It's the process of the definition of the offices not being betrayed by its agents, which has always been historically observed as the biggest threat, which under the fascist position facilitates a criminal rich scheme, at which point those who are being created wealthy by the white nationalist wizard communists have no interest in the rule of law succeeding, thus they mutually comply in the mechanism of generating a fascist state, exponentially increasing the fraudulent profits which, being acknowledged as not lawfully acquired, generates the position of being exponentially poor, at which point the alternative function of those who are substantively, competently, and legally wealthy have an obligation to acquire legal profits, at which point their desire under the position of being really rich is the exponential connections to legitimate legal profits, such as those obstructed in the War on David. Thus, the position of the obstructed records cannot legally change to their advantage the profits by margins, although they can attach to it under the obstructed uh, arrangements, which generates their capacity to the exponential legal profit. As the law does not give the right of the suppression of the processes of the government to have changed the legal status or the contracts or the accounting or the human decency, there is no substantive legal procedure which suppressed that wealth, at which point there is no change on the basis of the receiving of the terrorism or the harassment from those acting as agents of government to betray the rigged, corrupt system is not legal, and thus the profits are generated derived by criminal intention, are collaborations to facilitate the mechanism of the overthrow of the United States, which is being funding and receiving of funds for acts of war against the United States by the wizard communism, which is aiding and abetting acts of war against the United States. The amorality of what they're doing seldom comes into play under the position of their morality, which is amoral. By definition, the non morality of their morality is the subversion of all stabilizing functions, at which point the existence of the black market as a source of funding without the power of the purse is a detachment function to the legal order, at which point it is the function of loyalty to Confederate insurrection. And this Confederate insurrection is the condemnation and rejection of all the United States of from having any authority at all. At which point the observation of terrorism, bills of attainder, human trafficking, and expo facto, by virtue of creating the obstructions and the delays of the proceedings in order to engage in the lie about the functions, at which point the criminal life of the terrorists involved being the substantive time period of how long it's going to take for them to release the information means by definition they're seeking to expire the function by terrorism and expo facto, making the substantive historic changes of the Americans into the Confederacy by these systematic frauds, such as the blocking of David's policies from the War on David. Now, David having the function of being owed the rule of law, such as the assistance of the general public in the protection of the original policies, was already the patriarchy and the primary influence in the market and in the politics of the entire arrangements of the United States, at which point the Confederacy, having already read the fine print from their cosign, whenever you go and buy a major piece of technology such as a cell phone, they say, have you read the terms and conditions? And you click yes. Whether or not you've read it, you've signed yes to it. And the act of having received it is the entirety of its obligation to you, at which point they, having co signed the position of having read the obstructed policies, are engaged in gaslighting and the obstruction of the general public having access to those policies, which materially is espionage war strategy in order to collapse national security. So it could not be considered that David if was receiving assistance in some way from wealthy members who donated an acceleration of the function, David would not be considered as having coasted off of their influence, as David was already the influence. What he would have done is he would have used the rule of law as the security mechanism to protect his legal status, which is entirely separate. So there are fraudulent judicial verdicts, such as the Confederate position, where the government gets to assert morality as a political force, which is specifically subverted by the rule of law, at which point the engagement proves that they are not Americans, as the morality of the amoral have no authority over morality, but are in fact asserting the position of creating a superior deity which generates punishments and rewards on the basis of morality, which is the function of a state established religion. And that state established religion for the white nationalists has generated many genocides, including the genocide against David Bowles and his family, as David is independently the patriarch or the starting of a new society, which generates from his posterity the long-standing values of the projected kingdom, at which point the obstruction of David would have stopped the function of him creating children as soon as he could have, which would have exponentially compounded from many, many pregnancies, which would have generated their ability to have asserted their place inside that kingdom, at which point the assertion of them being able to have been born into that would have been able to be born into the extraordinary wealth, accelerating their education into establishing their place inside that kingdom, which would have been which would have accelerated them as preferred opportunity into that manifestation of their office, which was viewed as a negative as it subsequently changes the sexual market, as many of the rapists believed that David would steal their girlfriends on the foundation that the most desirable thing is to be with the most desirable person, including the position of the wealthiest, most powerful, and smartest, at which point David is the most desirable sexual option, creates the alternative attention from the rapist into the patriarchy and legitimate superior opportunities, and the desired position, such as um, asserted by personal ambition and wealth, would have been to create as many children for him as possible, at which point those creating as many provable children of David as possible would have been able to establish their position as queens under the insurance structure on the basis of being able to rely on their heirs to support them, who dividing up the same amount of money is merely a question of how many of them, by comparison to the others, that they would have received as the subdivision of David's title, at which point 100% divides 100%, at which point if there are 5, then it's going to divide differently than 15, is going to divide differently than 40, is going to divide differently than X, Y, or Z, at which point the compounding interest to have done so capitalizes on their consolidation and negotiation on the sexual market brokerage from the rejection hotline from Angelina Jolie in the obstructed records and contracts, generating the position of the original market. Executive privilege, as separate to the treasonous unitary executive privilege, is the assertion of client lawyer privilege. And the client lawyer privilege, as you look up in the law, does not allow for the lawyer to defend the criminal actions of the conspirators who confess to it, at which point the act of having conducted the confession in the arrangements to the lawyer generates the obligation of the lawyer to comply to the protocols to the substantive authorities, at which point this, as intelligence oversight, is a function of Congress, which would have actively received the information from David's branch of the military. And as David is obstructed from his position as top ranked general, he would have had a position in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which would have facilitated his ability to inform Congress more efficiently. Confederates having come up with many subversive mechanisms against the United States, such as the creation of Project Palantir for total information awareness, operated from DARPA, from John Dexter, who was a co-conspirator in Iran-Contra, at which point many of these arrangements and the subversion of the United States has targeted David Bowles from those mechanisms and others in the projection in order to manifest the sedition of stopping the legal government from forming so that they could block the functions of the government as they manufacture fraudulent simulations such as the mechanism of the Manchurian Candidate by captured targets who, being stalked by these mechanisms, are permanently subjugated to simulations which are facilitated by the controlling of their lives by indirect measures such as the controlling of associations, the obstructions of associations, the obstructions of contracts, and the general manipulation of their life, including the function of the criminal application of labeling them an enemy combatant in order to hold them as a POW, in order to facilitate the connection to the military-industrial educational complex, in order to facilitate false experiments for extortionary punishments, which generates the permanent state of criminal injury, and using that against the position of subversives, which is counterintuitive from a legal point of view because a subversive conducting the legal function of their position in society, such as civilians engaging in the vote for the altering of the government in order to form a popular legal government, would be the act of sedition against the function of government in the vote or the forming of government, including the targeting of those who were assessed to be high-ranking members of the government on maturity, such as David Bowles, who, being intelligence oversight and estimated capable and competent in order to defeat their psychopaths, had to be restrained from the function in order to guarantee that the sedition vulnerable government would collapse. So these systems of insurrection being exponentially higher threats than the false flag of January 6th was also in the record specifically responsible for it. It has nothing to do with the mechanism of preventing crime ahead of time, but the act of creating alternative vulnerabilities in order to guarantee that their predetermined crimes succeed without a hitch. So if they generate many of those simulations for strawman arguments, you can manufacture the fraudulent excuses to their predetermined answer with pre-convictions without criminal intent or indication of criminal intent, which is a specific subversion of due process, including the act of actually being guilty of anything, and in the position of them being able to use the extortion mechanism is specifically subversive of it, even in the position of their own point of view argument, which generates the specific vulnerability of the political targeting systems, such as the ones promoted by Lindsey Graham for the specific targeting of anyone, anywhere, for any reason, including race, which is the function of the COINTELPRO and MKUltra mechanisms in order to extort and collapse those who were labeled uh, dissidents on the basis of them being community leaders of targeted communities, which, having a lawful right to be left to their own devices, were actively being subverted in favor of the Confederacy insurrection, views their collective race and society as undesirables, which manufactures the systemic racism which is generated in the non-acknowledged position as if they do not admit to it, it didn't happen, the wizard communists who generate the threat to national security.